Hi, and welcome. This is Ken Wilber's Stages of Growing Up and Waking Up, which is basically psychological growth and spiritual growth, and I'm going to map it out and be pretty clear and detailed about it all. And maybe you've heard Ken talk, maybe you haven't. Maybe you've heard of stages of faith, stages of growth, and what Ken Wilber's done is he's integrated basically a whole lot of that from various researchers, various thinkers, and Ken Wilber is kind of into the integration of all knowledge in all academic disciplines, but it blends with spirituality. And I think for Christianity, this is a great model of what Christianity at its best can be. You know, we can be a conveyor belt where we help people go through these stages. And many churches don't do that, probably just because a lot of the general population is in a stage that can just be talked to in basic belief systems, rinse and repeat, or whatever they say as most sermons go. So my site's contemplativelight.com. I just wanted to say thank you, Ken, because he's put all this together. I never would have had the time or the energy to come up with all of this and put all of this completely together just the way he has. It's just an extensive amount of reading and writing. So basically what it is there's two types of growth, and one is growing up, one's waking up, and you can think of them like this. Growing up is kind of structures of mind and consciousness, psychological, philosophical, developmental psychology. It's kind of your worldview, how you understand the world in general, and it happens in healthy individuals at a certain age sequence in developmental psychology. But most adults have parts of themselves in various stages, and most of them are not towards the top. They're in some one of the middle ones. And waking up stages, I'm going to go over those too, and those are states. Those are states of mind. Spiritual, mystical awareness, religious traditions. This is the road to enlightenment, the road to divine union. This is the meditative path, starting to open up your spirit, your soul, your consciousness, while the other one is much more of kind of a mental, psychological, or philosophical thing. And a lot of the things you see, maybe even too in academia, although these stages aren't usually explicitly talked about. So here's the general outline for where we're going, and I'm going to do an introduction to terminology, maturity. What kind of maturity exactly are we talking about? Because this kind of may be new, and maturity may not even be the best word. Historical differences, East and West. The East has been good at the waking up stages. The West has been more of a contributor into the growing up with Western psychology. And so we're looking at both of those two paths of growth, structure and state. And again, structure, growing up, state, waking up. And the structures of thought and the developmental psychology aspect of this also mirrors the history of thought, the history of the human mind, the species in general, humanity, and how we're growing and how we're thinking just collectively as a group. And on the waking up scale, you have it's the consciousness of spirit. It's a lot of what monks have traditionally taught, and the mystical traditions of all religions have typically taught their practitioners on the road to enlightenment or divine union or getting closer to God, or however they phrase it. And so, I'll talk about these E and F right now, precursors to growing up and precursors to waking up. Like the precursors to growing up, as I said, was a lot of developmental psychologists. You had Erik Erikson, you had Kohlberg, Scott Peck, Fowler, Piaget, a lot of those that had all the stages. And this is just kind of a continuation of those into the higher levels to some degree, and mirroring it with the evolution of human thought. And the precursors to waking up is different religious writers and religious traditions that have mapped out the states of consciousness. And Christianity has one too. They have several, obviously, and they have St. John of the Cross and St. Teresa of Avila, the Spanish mystics in the Middle Ages, some of the Rhineland mystics. They all talked about different phases of their contemplative life that they went through. And most recently, we got a great contribution from Evelyn Underhill, an Anglican Episcopalian in the early 20th century, in her book Mysticism. And she goes over the stages of mysticism as she reviews the mystical literature and the history of different mystics. So here's growing up, and then I'll go through growing up and waking up, and I'll go through the different stages. So terminology, maturity, again, we're talking about, this is growing up, psychological, philosophical. That's for growing up. Real states, not creative imagination. So these are kind of discovered. This is something that's kind of been discovered, that people have gone through. There is a path here. This isn't like L. Ron Hubbard sitting and writing a fantasy book and then turning it into a religion, or anything like that, or it's just not a fantasy book at all. So the growing up model is similar to Dr. Fowler's Stages of Faith. Fowler was a notable theologian, recently passed away at Emory University. He had Stages of Faith. A lot of seminarians that go through seminary school of some kind to become ordained ministers and priests study Dr. Fowler's Stages of Faith, which is kind of the spiritual version that picks up where Piaget laid the kind of developmental psychological foundations. And then the waking up model, very similar to Evelyn Underhill's Stages of Mysticism. And again, you can find Evelyn Underhill and her book Mysticism, a study on the nature of spiritual consciousness. Developmental psychology corresponds with historical evolution. I remember I had a class, Psychology of Religion, I think, when I was like 20 or 21, at Vassar, and I remember that just kind of blew my mind, that the history of man kind of corresponds with the developmental of the individual, and I'll map that out in a second. We also have the idea that these are hidden maps, like we're all in this grid whether we know it or not. We're all following these whether we know it or not. It's kind of like the grammar rules. Like I'm talking right now, maybe I'm using good grammar, maybe not. But if I am using good grammar, I couldn't tell you exactly what rules I'm following and what rules I'm not following. But I have my way of talking, and it comes out generally okay and matches up with English as it's intended to be. So, that's kind of how we all go about things. We do things without really realizing the rules we're following. But we know them. We know them implicitly. We just couldn't explicitly explain them. And that's kind of like these maps are. So the historical differences, in the West, we were good at growing up, especially in the 20th century. With just a lot of just the birth of psychology. You had Freud and everything after. And psychologists like Kohlberg, Piaget, Erickson, Scott Peck, they've all, I guess Scott Peck was a psychiatrist, but one of his popular bestsellers, not The Road Less Traveled, but I think his second one, Further Along the Road Less Traveled, that one just actually broke these down into 4 simple stages, which may be an okay place to start, because Peck was very good at taking all this and just simplifying it and selling a lot of books. Theologians like Fowler, archetypalist or archetypal psychologists like Carl Jung, James Hillman, they've gone over some of this ground, and just a lot of empirical researchers that probably are less famous or have less name recognition have traced a whole lot. You had Graves doing the spiral dynamics and just a whole lot of things. But anyways, these are these are the kind of Western views of the mind and the maturity of the mind, the maturity of the individual, and the worldview perspective. And that is growing up again. And so on the waking up side, the spiritual angle, the religious traditions have been actually pretty good at this. They just, the key point here is that they have not included growing up. In the West, it's not included waking up. So in the West, we're not really talking about waking up in consciousness. I mean, obviously we have a whole birth of kind of New Age stuff and Buddhist stuff and all this stuff coming into America in the 60s and 70s, and just, now you have like a yoga studio on every corner just about. So we're getting a lot of it, but it's not really kind of part of our standard curriculum in schools at all. And in fact, it's almost something you just kind of disregard altogether. And that may have some to do with the differences between church and state and stuff. But, so the takeaway here is there's similarities through different religious traditions. It's not exact, obviously, but mystical religious traditions have not included Western psychological models, and vice versa, generally speaking. So this, again, structures of consciousness. You can think of growing up, the stages of psychological, philosophical development, structures of consciousness, growing up. You can think of these structures as, structures of consciousness that progress in stages during healthy, continual psychological and philosophical development. I guess if you were just to have a perfect upbringing and just a clean path forward, these would model a certain age and a certain developmental age, and happen at a point in your life at a certain age that could be traced. But again, most people don't have that path, and they kind of prefer, one of these stages that, they go through or they witness or they come to, they either get stuck in or, but obviously in their mind, they're not getting stuck in them. They're liking them, they've got the right view. But they're just stages. They're stages to pass through. And you can think of these structures of consciousness as just the filter, the view angle of reality. So it's just kind of like the skeleton. If your mind has all these mental formations, it's kind of the skeleton of your mental formations. Kind of like you see a house going under construction, and you just kind of see the raw frame there, and it can only be so many things at that point. You can make the walls all different things, but you've got the frame. So it's going to take a certain form, and that's kind of like the way our mind works. We're looking at reality, but it's going to kind of take a certain form, and we're going to kind of have a basic take on it, even if we're not necessarily sure we're doing that. And you can think of it as just glasses. The glasses you wear, your perspective. A lot of times in self-help talk, they'll talk about a new pair of glasses. They'll talk about, changing your perspective to something more positive, blah, blah, blah. This is similar to that, but this is not necessarily changing from negative thinking to positive thinking. This is more like changing from limited thinking to a more open, unified thinking. This is more of a move from naivety and ignorance to wisdom. This is a move towards wisdom, basically. This is a path of wisdom. So next, coming up in the next video, I'll probably just continue where I left off. But I hope you enjoyed this. Check out contemplativelight.com if you're interested in more, or just kind of watch these other videos on Wilber. Thanks a lot, everybody. I appreciate your time and effort and interest in all this.